Well, obviously today we hear again from John's chapter 6, his gospel. And instead of just, repeating what Father Andre said 2 weeks ago, and I think what Father Eric said last week about the bread of life and the things like that, I really want to show to you, or point out to you, why Jesus is doing this, why he's building up. There's a build-up here within the gospel that is hard to recognize sometimes. So I'm going to go a little bit chapter by chapter for you. So most people say that John's gospel was the least sacramental gospel. One, because there's no baptism, so Jesus isn't baptized in the gospel. And then the second is because there's no Eucharistic narrative. In the Last Supper, he doesn't say, take and eat like they do in the Synoptic Gospels in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So I'm going to show you why it is sacramental. So let's start with John 1:14. First of all, John says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth." The Word became flesh. The word there is logos. Another word for logos is wisdom. Harkening back to the first reading today, wisdom will give you food. Wisdom will give you wine to drink. So you should be pinging there on the wisdom that God, Jesus Christ, is that Word, is that wisdom made flesh. In chapter 2, the wedding in Cana, the miracle of the water turned into wine. The wine, the great miracle that happens, the multitude of wine being poured out, not for those that really needed it, or that didn't need it, but for those that needed it, the poor couple that didn't have enough wine to have a full party. Chapter 4, the woman at the well. "Everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. The water that I shall give him will become in him a spring of water welling up in eternal life." So we see here an eternal life. I will give you water. I will give you bread. I will give you wine. Very sacramental analogies we have here. And then obviously John chapter 6, the beginning of John chapter 6, "I will feed the 5,000. So he feeds the 5,000 with just a few loaves of bread, just a few grains of fish. The bread there being the multiplication. Also, in John chapter 6, he's telling this bread of life discourse is happening in Capernaum. Capernaum is also, Cana is also in Capernaum. So it's bringing back to that first miracle of the wine being changed, or the water being changed into wine. So you have something extra there of the wine and the water. Also in John chapter 6, he says, "Do not labor for the food which perishes, but the food that endures to eternal life." And then also, "Lord gives us this bread. Lord, give us this bread always." This harkens back to the woman at the well who said, "Lord, give me this drink, this living water always." There's a hunger here. They want the bread. They want Jesus' flesh, but they don't want it like they think they want it. And then obviously we have the 3 I am statements. I am the bread of life. 3 times in a row. We've heard it 2 weeks ago, last week, and then this week again. I am the bread of life. This isn't something allegorical. This isn't something that Jesus is just saying, as a good teaching. No, he is the bread of life. And we receive the bread of life in the Eucharist. So it's all building up here. It's building up towards what is coming to be the Last Supper here, if we can see it. If we can see John's gospel, the implicit becomes explicit when we look through a sacramental lens. I also want to mention, I haven't mentioned it, but also that the Old Testament builds up it too. So in the priest Melchizedek, in the book of Genesis, after Abraham gives him a certain amount of land, he offers bread and wine as a sacrament. Melchizedek was a priest and a king. So it's Jesus as the new Melchizedek, acting as the new Melchizedek. In the Passover, they eat unleavened bread before they go out into the desert. And then also in the desert, obviously, Moses feeds them with manna and quail. The manna being that life that sustains them, but they didn't eat it. And that's why Jesus says in the gospel today, your ancestors ate that bread, but they still died. So there's something more that Jesus wants to give them. There's something greater than Moses here, if we have time to see it. One of the things about food that I love so much, I don't know about y'all, but I can just tell y'all straight up, there's no competition here. My mother was the greatest cook in the world. She loved to cook, and one of my favorite things, and I love to eat her cooking too. One of my favorite things that she would make was something called meat with tomato gravy. Now it's like a roast kind of sort of, but it was cut up into little cubes or chunks. And instead of like a brown gravy or an onion gravy, she'd make like a spaghetti sauce kind of, like a beef courtbouillon, so to speak. If, some of y'all might know what that is, and serve it over rice. But I mean, so good, so awesome. It was like you got what we call the itis afterwards. You know, that feeling of you're so satisfied, you're so fulfilled that you just want to go to sleep. You know, just pass out on the couch, you know. Or you want to adapt Simeon's confession when he's holding the baby Jesus. Lord, now let your servant go in peace. I have received a taste of heaven in this cooking right here. But the problem with that food, with that great, as much as I loved it, as much as I desired it, there's no comparison with the Eucharist. There's nothing greater than the Eucharist, than that living food that we receive. It's food. It sustains me, but it only sustains me for so long. After a few hours, I'm hungry again. Jesus offers us something better if we have eyes to see it. But sometimes we don't. Sometimes we want the instant gratification. We get trapped in the gratification of, hey, you know what? This is pleasing right now, but it doesn't last. It's like having that birthday cake or that really nice dessert. It tastes great right when you eat it. But if that's all you had, you didn't have the meal beforehand, you'd be hungry in 2 hours. It doesn't sustain us. Jesus offers us something that's going to sustain us for eternal life if we have eyes to see it. So in the gospel, we see him also saying, eat my flesh. If you eat my flesh and drink my blood. Eat my flesh there is a really loose translation. The really word you should be hearing is gnaw. Gnaw at my flesh. Gnaw at my blood. To gnaw at something means that you're hungry for it. Means you need it. And that's the thing. We need Jesus. We need the bread of life to live forever. We can't survive without it. But sometimes we just see the food in front of us. If we only eat the food in front of us, if we see that, if we're mixed, if we're upside down, then we'll just see that as what we need to live. Oh, this supports me now. We should be looking at what supports us for eternal life. Not just living for this life, but living for the kingdom to come, the eternal kingdom. That's something very, very important in this gospel as well. One story I love to tell is actually from Father Andre. Some of y'all don't get to hear it before Mass, but Father Andre says a prayer before we come out and process out. And he normally quotes a certain specific prayer. He adapts it a little bit, but this is the prayer. O priest of Jesus Christ, celebrate this holy Mass as if it were your first Mass, your last Mass, and your only Mass. Are we hungry enough to where we can say, enter into this Mass as if it was our first Mass, our last Mass, our only Mass? When we come up here to receive communion, are we receiving Jesus as if it was the first time we received Jesus, the last time we received Jesus, the only time we received Jesus? Or is it just something we do after the Our Father and the priest says a few words, and it's just something everyone else does and we just do it? The Eucharist is special if we have eyes to see it. But if we don't, then it's just a piece of bread to us. And that's something that's not living our Catholic faith. The Catholic faith is centered on the sacraments. It's centered on the Eucharist because it's gospel. Because that's what Jesus gives us to sustain us in this world in preparation for the world to come. But we have to have eyes to see it. We'll hear next week, a lot of them didn't have eyes to see it. They left. They couldn't handle it. They couldn't take it. They couldn't see what Jesus was giving them. They just saw the immediacy. They saw the short game. They couldn't see the long game. And that's something. I am, being a seminarian, I've received a lot of Jesus in my lifetime. And I've become a host connoisseur, so to speak, you know. There's different types of hosts that we buy that we consecrate to Jesus. So there's the white kind, which is just, you know, regular white flour and water. Then there's the whole wheat kind, which is pretty good, you know, it's got whole wheat. And then there's also the gluten-free kind. So if you have allergies, you know, you have gluten allergies, they have gluten-free hosts. But I think the best host I've ever tasted was actually at the monastery at St. Ben's. I don't know where they get these hosts from or what, but it's like the most spectacular thing you put in your mouth when you're receiving Jesus. We need to receive Jesus like that Whether we're receiving the most blandest host in the world, or we're receiving some of the most dullest wine in the world. It might not be a Cabernet 1928, but it is the body and blood of Christ. And that's what we're receiving. That's what we need to see. So I ask you, how are you hungry for Christ? How do you get hungry for Christ? Well, what I suggest is that we need to utilize our prayer time before Mass a little bit more. When I know a lot of y'all sit here, y'all come into church, y'all kneel down, you pray, make the sign of the cross, and then you offer some prayers to God, and it might be about finances, it might be about, your daughter that's turning out just like you and you don't know how to stop it, and, all these crazy things, or your husband that, almost killed us driving here today to Mass, whatever it might be. Before you end your prayer, ask God, help me to hunger. Help me to hunger for you, Lord. Help me to be so humble that I can receive you as if it was my first, my last, my only time receiving you. As if it was, I knew what I was receiving. As if I knew that I would be a Eucharistic person. As if when I left this place, I would go out and change the world. Because that's what we receive. We receive the grace to go out and live what Christ has given us to live. Can we do that? Can we hunger for Christ so much that we need to gnaw on Him? That is the only thing that we have, is the most important thing that sustains us forever. And so I tell you, be proud to be Catholic. Don't hide from the Eucharist. Oh, I don't want to talk about the Eucharist with these people because, they might think I'm weird or a cannibal. Be proud of it because it is gospel. We don't hide from the gospel. It is in gospel. Take and eat. This is my body. This is my blood. We need to be proud to be Catholic. Be proud of the sacraments that Jesus has given us, that the church safeguards. And also be proud to be a Eucharistic people. Because when we are Eucharistic people, then we understand our mission in life.